Today is October 15th, 2024. My guest is filmmaker Penny Lane. This is her second appearance on the program. She was here in January of 2022 talking about her documentary, Listening to Kenny G. Today we're going to talk about her new documentary, Confessions of a Good Samaritan, which is scheduled to air on Netflix right about now. Penny, welcome back to Econ Talk.
Great to be here, Russ. Thank you.
In 2016, a while ago, you made a decision to donate a kidney to a stranger. And in August of 2019, about 3 years later, you had surgery and one of your two kidneys was removed and put in someone else's body. And you made a movie about it. And that's what we're going to talk about. And I want to start with the obvious question. Why would you ever think this was a good idea?
Why? It's such a hard question to answer. Why does someone choose to have a child? Why does someone decide to move to another country at some point in their life? I mean, there are things you do that seem good to you, that seem like they're going to have a good outcome for you, but without a cultural script attached to it, it can be hard to say why. I think with children, if you want to make a parallel, people will say, oh, I think about my legacy, or I'm tired of being selfish, or, isn't that the purpose of life, to give life to others? And I think those are scripts that we've learned to explain something quite deep and complicated inside of us. So to answer your question, it just seemed like a good idea. It seemed like, if you look at the benefit to the recipient, likely benefit to the recipient, and you compare it to the transient suffering of my own, going through surgery and all the fear that goes along with that and everything, it's like, in a mathematical way, an obviously good idea. Then you get into the complications of why is it that I feel it's an obviously good idea, and I'm putting finger quotes around that quote right now, obviously good idea, and to everyone else it just seems kind of strange or maybe even crazy or suspect in some way. And that question, that psychological mystery, is why I made the film. On a secondary level, of course, I hoped it would encourage others to consider this saving a life option. But to be truthful, as an artist, the psychological mystery of that was why I made the film.
And I would say it's an extraordinary film. It would have been extraordinary if you'd made a film about why people donate kidneys to strangers, but you made a film about Penny Lane giving a kidney to a stranger, and the level of vulnerability and openness is a little bit hard to watch, but you can't stop watching. It's really a really powerful and thought-provoking, not just powerful, it's thought-provoking about this phenomenon. We've done many episodes on kidney donation, I realized after I watched it. So we'll put a link up. I'm laughing because what podcast has lots of episodes about kidney donation, but we'll put up links to those episodes. Part of the reason this is so fascinating, and when we talk about your place in it, is that people said, oh, you're making this because you want to get a movie out of it. And you talk about that on the film. Why is that kind of a implausible argument?
Well, it's not totally implausible, I suppose, other than the fact that I'd already signed up to give the kidney and was well underway in my testing before I also then made the decision to make the film. So just factually, that's not true. But I think the thing you're really asking about is why did that upset me so much?
Yeah.
It really upsets me, and it made me almost not want to make the film because I guess, and we could get into this maybe more later, but there's some idea that if you do an altruistic thing and you seek attention for it, or if you're perceived to seek attention for it, that undermines the goodness of the act, that there's ideas, and I think a Judeo-Christian, but more Christian worldview that that good deeds should be secret or, should be not advertised in any way. And then that's how you keep them pure. I get that. I mean, look, I did an anonymous kidney donation. Clearly, I get that. I'm not seeking thanks from the recipient or anything. So I was just so anxious that people would think I was like doing some kind of stunt for a movie. And I don't know, I guess it just felt like the fear of being misunderstood. I think that's a big fear of mine, the fear of being misunderstood. And so I just, that's the thing that maybe made me the most afraid about making the movie. That and the fact that when you make a personal film like this, it's like you're giving the whole world the secret to hurting you. You're like, here are the things that I'm most afraid of. Here are the things that make me the most ashamed. Here are the things that bring me the most angst. And you're like, here they are, world. It's like you're handing the world the key to hurt you. So it was, I would say, what was more courageous, Russ, making the film or doing the surgery? Maybe making the film was the more...
Well, having watched it, and I watched it last night in one sitting, I think you could make a case for making the film because it is, you said it better than I could, you revealed what makes you vulnerable, what scares you, what you fear. It also, of course, revealed what makes you happy and cheers you up and all that too. But there is something very brave about it. And I'd like to ask if you had any regrets about that, but it hasn't aired yet, so we'll talk in a year. But let's cover this. You do say early on in the documentary that as this process goes on, and it's if you haven't explored it or watched the documentary yet, it's surprising how many hurdles. You'd think people would say, come on, oh, great, here, oh, come on, you put the gown on. When you say you're actually willing, you said people think it's weird, and I think it's honorable, brave, glorious, commendable, spectacular, just a lovely, lovely human thing to do. And yet, early on in the process, which is quite long, we'll get into some of it, you felt like you'd made a terrible mistake, which is strange because you haven't done it yet. You could say it now. You could say it right the day after the surgery in 2019. We're now 5 years later. But why at the time did you feel in the process you were making a terrible mistake?
I think that the process can kind of wear you down a little bit, I think. It is a slow process. There are many tests you have to go through. They really make you wait. And it makes sense. The transplant centers, the last thing they can bear would be an altruistic donor who has a bad experience and regrets it and goes public, and that would be bad, right? And also they want to make sure you're not doing it for like reasons that we as a society have decided are bad, like, for example, if you go to a transplant center and you say, I want to give a kidney to a stranger because I hate myself and I hope this will help me like myself more, which in my opinion is not that bad of a reason, they will say no to you. That is not considered an acceptable reason. I think there's a lot of fear and, again, suspicion around the idea. And even in the transplant world, I think there's a lot of fear and suspicion around the idea and fear that people are doing it for the, quote, wrong reasons. Anyway, the reason I felt like I was making a terrible mistake in that moment in the film is that it was about 5 days before surgery, and I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified of surgery. I had never had surgery before, major surgery before. I really didn't know what it would be like. I was scared. Not that I would die or something, but that it would be some kind of existential suffering that I had signed myself up for. It ended up being fine. Let me just jump to the end. It was fine. Yeah. I was way overwrought about how terrified I was about surgery. But I think I felt like I was making a mistake because I was scared and because so many people, whether it was inside the transplant world or outside the transplant world, had just looked at me with that expression on their face that they thought there was something wrong with me, that I thought, maybe there is something wrong with me. Why am I doing this to myself?
And there's so many fascinating questions that your work raises. And one of them is this idea that there must be something wrong with you, right? I'm this kind of donation, meaning not to a loved one, not to a close friend, but to a stranger, called an altruistic donation or an anonymous donation, reminds me, if I may say so, a little bit of people who harbored Jews during the Holocaust. It seems to me to be a remarkably brave and, as I said, commendable thing to do. And if anything, you should get either like a permanent tattoo or a placard or a sandwich board you could wear around town. I once gave a kidney back in 2019, or I saved Jews. In fact, so, and the reason I make that slightly absurd comparison, there's obviously they're about saving lives, but the reason I make it is that only hundreds of people a year make an altruistic donation.
Correct.
And I can't decide whether that's a small number or a big number, right? On a certain level, it's a small number. America's a big country, and hundreds seems like tiny, but that anyone would do it. Any one person would be like an amazing thing. And why wouldn't we have an annual day for those people, or a parade for Penny Lane, and applaud? And if you said, I'm not feeling so good about myself, I think this will cheer me up a little bit, I would say, great. There are people, the list of people waiting for a kidney who are suffering through dialysis or who die before they get one is so long. I would think it'd just be a gloriously good thing. What are your thoughts on that? Why do people think it's weird or even worse, grotesque?
Well, there's so many reasons, Russ. I mean, and the film gets into some of this, but let's start with the word grotesque, because I do think there's an element of visceral reaction, an element of disgust that some people have about transplantation in general. And I think that, it grosses people out. It seems just wrong somehow. Like, if I have 2 kidneys, surely I must need them both. You don't. But, God made me that way. And there's something disgusting about it. The idea, for some people, just the idea of like an organ from one person going inside another person's body it grosses them out, and it makes them think there must be something wrong with it. So there's that objection, which I think is usually more unspoken and not even necessarily conscious. But I do think there's a disgust element there. On another level, there's the newness of the procedure. Most people don't know that you can give a kidney to a stranger, or that the surgery is, you have to be careful in how you say it, not without risk, but relatively safe. So I think a lot of people think it's more dangerous than it really is, and they've never heard of the idea, and it just sounds, therefore, crazy. But if you look at the history of organ transplantation, and we get into this in the film, every stage of that technological advancement was met with the same moral objections. So at the very beginning of the era of transplantation, which would be the 60s, surgeons started to figure out they could do it between identical twins because the organs wouldn't be rejected because of the match genetically. Even then, if you go back and you look at the news coverage, the contemporaneous discourse, this was so controversial. People in general thought this was a terrible idea and that doctors should not do it, and that there was something probably wrong with the brother who wanted to give his kidney to his twin to save his life. I know you're making a face, but this is true. And you flash forward a bit more as that technological advancement goes wider and wider. So now you can have more distantly related people, mothers, cousins, whatever. Same thing. Oh, this seems like there's something wrong. Mothers shouldn't want to do this for their son. What's wrong with them? Maybe they're, suffering, and so maybe they're like psychologically off in some way. So I do think there's a historical contingency part of it where it's simply a new idea and people are weirded out by new ideas. The third thing that I think is happening there with the people, with the reaction of the negative reaction, is something that in psychology is called do-gooder derogation, which is such a great phrase. Do-gooder derogation. And it's this idea that, the studies have mostly been done with vegans. People hate vegans. They hate vegans. Why? They hate vegans because there's something about the idea of looking at someone who's doing good in a way that feels like a judgment against themselves. And I do think that's a factor as well. We say we like do-gooders, but when we come across one, certainly the intellectual part of us is meant to, kind of question, critique, what are they really doing this for? Are they really good? And I think that's a self-protective defense. And I just want to say, I think I do that too, just in different areas. I think we probably all do. See someone who's doing good in a way that we don't do, or that we don't know how to do, or that we think we never could do, and that maybe we have a little bit of like judgment against them as a protective measure. But I also just want to say, most people think it's a good thing to do. I don't want to overstate the negative reactions. It's just that it's palpable and it's real. Like something like 1 in 10 people that I've interacted with on this topic has an actually negative reaction, whether they say it or I can just see it in their face. It's negative, but that's still like 1 in 10, you know?
Wow. People give blood, which is real similar to donating a kidney. The difference is you don't your kidney doesn't grow back. You just have a backup. Whereas with blood, your body generates it again. So it's surprising to me. There's an ick factor. I get it. There's an ick factor for giving blood, but nobody would feel justified in expressing it. I would suggest. I would just mention, by the way, it's laparoscopic, the surgery, meaning it's a very small incision. That doesn't mean it's minor surgery. It's a serious surgery, but it's not what you might imagine when you think about having your kidney removed. So it's fascinating to me that there's even 10% that view it as somehow inappropriate. The fascinating thing for me that your film illustrates is this change over time. That during the twin procedure, which was more dangerous, and then as they developed a drug that would let you donate a kidney to a stranger by suppressing their immune system response to the kidney and not reject it, attitudes changed in response to that technology. And I think that's extremely interesting. But if we could imagine a world where if I could snap my fingers, my kidney would jump into your body, I guess you wouldn't get any disgust and you wouldn't get much commendation either because, you didn't suffer, right? So you suffered. Yeah.
I did suffer. And I want to say, not being totally certain about making the film, but I did decide to start filming just before surgery. I was like, I just need to film this. This is a once-in-a-lifetime thing, literally. I'm very well positioned to make a film about this. If someone is going to make a film about this, here I am, a documentary filmmaker about to do this surgery. So we started filming. And actually the footage that convinced me to make the film, Russ, and you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about, is the footage of my body coming down the hallway out of the surgical procedure. My camera person is filming, I'm unconscious. Yeah, and I look like all bloated, like white as a sheet, like I look like a corpse. And you sort of watch me wake up from surgery sobbing for some reason, and it's so vulnerable. And I felt, looking at that footage, that I had to make this film because there was something about the image of it. I don't think I would have understood the nature of my own sacrifice had I not seen that footage. It just is so real. It's like this person has put themselves through a lot to get to this point. And it made me feel so strongly and so complicated about the whole thing in a good way. So I was like, okay, we're making this film. But yeah, so the fact that I suffered, the fact that I really didn't, I had kind of a bad experience through the whole thing. And I was like freaking out and anxious and neurotic and questioning myself. That to me, I felt such guilt and shame about, because the whole thing was that I'm supposed to be thinking about the recipient, man. Like they're suffering a lot worse than me. And so why is my minor suffering now so salient? And why can't I just think about this recipient who I've never met and I never will meet? It was so interesting. It was like the parable of the Good Samaritan in real life. Like did the Good Samaritan, as they were dragging the dying man to the inn, kind of think, oh man, why am I doing this? Now I'm going to be late for work, and I'm going to give the inn some money, but I don't really have that much money. Is my wife going to yell at me? I mean, yeah, probably all those things happen, but it's not in the story. And so when you're doing it, you're like, oh man, I'm a bad Good Samaritan. Like I'm supposed to just be walking through this feeling like good about myself and, honorable and kind of, so happy that I was helping this other person. In fact, it was very hard to keep the other person at top of mind throughout the experience. And as it would be. Maybe if I'd given to my dearly beloved sister, I could picture her face and, really remind myself why I was doing this. But I had to remind myself of why I was doing this in a very abstract way. And that was challenging. Yeah.
And you interviewed a bunch of other donors who were so happy. And it's, at least after the fact, by the way, let's be fair to you.
Yes.
They were glowing. And for them, at least the ones you showed us, there may have been others, but the ones you show us, it's not like, it was a tough decision. It was like, my favorite was, if I had 100 kidneys, I'd give away 100. Well, 99. I think he says 100, period. But I wish I had 100 to give away. And you said, one a year for 100? Absolutely. It's like, who are these people?
Yeah, I definitely wondered about that. And that's a big tension in the film. And for me, very unresolved. Are the Good Samaritan donors special and different in some way, or are they not? And there's kind of like evidence on both sides, like on the one hand, you could go into the neuroscience aspect of it. And I do interview a psychologist in the film who's done, brain scan studies of Good Samaritan donors and have found that their brains are different from normal people in significant ways on average. I don't know what that tells us, but there's a data point. On the other hand, no, they're not special at all. They're just people who saw an opportunity to help and took it. I mean, there's nothing unique about this population. So I really struggle with that. At the end of the project, I still don't know whether there's something special about these people. Are they different from other people or are they not? I will say that on an anecdotal level, I met the psychologist who studies the brains of Good Samaritan donors actually totally randomly in the world before I knew that she was this expert and before I'd had the surgery myself. And she said later, "Oh, I knew when I met you." And I was like, "God damn, how? How did you know? I don't think I'm one of those people. I'm a normal person, But she claimed that she could tell that I was one of these altruists, one of these super altruists that she studies. I don't know. I don't feel like that. I don't feel like I'm an altruist. And she would say that's what all the altruists say. So,
yeah, it's a dead giveaway. How did it make you feel when she said that?
Confused, just confused. I have not walked through the world believing that I am a person who is especially empathetic or especially altruistic. And ultimately, I don't know if anyone does. I have no idea. I can't inhabit anyone else's mind. I do feel now, 5 years later, 5 years after the surgery, that whether or not I believe I'm an altruistic person, there's some facts at hand that suggest that I must be. That gives me a little bit of self-confidence in some way, a little different than maybe before. I feel like I have some evidence that maybe I am an altruistic person. I at least did a very seriously altruistic thing once in my life, and that's not nothing,
In fact, watching the film, I found that whole part, that sub-theme fascinating, that you would be worried about it or care about it or have anxiety about it. Most people don't. I don't think they care. They may feel they don't do, quote, enough. But one thing that just screams out of the movie is your need to feel that you are a good person, and that you had doubts about it made me sad watching the movie because, like I said, first of all, you've been on Econ Talk, so you're obviously a nice person. And secondly, that you gave away a kidney. Only one good deed, but it's kind of a big good deed. So I watching as an outsider, I didn't have any doubts about it. And I might have thought, if I didn't watch the film, that was sort of, I don't know, shtick that you needed to put in to make the film more interesting. But when you watch the film, I don't think it's shtick. I think that's the way you really felt, and I don't think you're acting for the camera.
Well, thank you for saying that. I do think that I have always worried about whether I'm a good person. I've been a diarist my whole life, and so I have pretty good evidence of this. I have diaries from when I was 12 and 13 where I worried about being a good person. Again, one of the great lessons of the film for me is that we imagine that we can inhabit the mind of another, and that it's probably pretty similar to our own mind. And in most cases, that might be true. I mean, that is the basis of empathy, right? Yeah. That we can look at another person and kind of imagine how they're feeling and probably have a pretty good guess how they might be feeling in a given circumstance. That said, there's a limit to that. And there is great mystery in terms of another person's mind. One of the things I said in my kind of monologue for the camera in the film, but I don't think I used it in the film, was, are there just people walking around like feeling like confident that they're good people all the time? Like, I can't even imagine what that would feel like. I have absolutely no idea. And I bet there are people that I just can't imagine it, like, to me, it's like, aren't you all like neurotically concerned about this? So there's a big, again, I kind of love in the end that what I was drawn to was the diversity of our internal experiences and actually honoring that and appreciating that. Because I think I started the film and I started the experience in a very kind of utilitarian, consequentialist mindset, where it's like, well, I was very influenced by the effective altruism movement to some extent, and I was very concerned with extending my care of concern, my sphere of concern to distant strangers who might need my help more actually than my next door neighbor. And that was such a revolution in thought that it really influenced me for many years. And I think that laid the groundwork for the kidney donation when I heard about the idea, which, by the way, had to have been on Econ Talk. I'm sure that my knowledge it came from Econ Talk. I have to go back and find out. Anyway, so then I do the surgery, I go through all this stuff, and I'm like, why aren't more people more concerned with strangers? And this is like a big bugaboo for me for years, ethically. And I do it, and I'm proud of myself. And as soon as I do it, I'm like, okay, maybe now it's time to think about being a good neighbor to my actual neighbors. What about my family? What about my friends? How can I be a better person in those ways? So it's like, the journey never ends, I sort of feel like, I give a lot of my money to charities that purport to do the most good worldwide. And that's money that goes to, again, distant strangers. But now I'm kind of like, okay, let me look around more closer to home. So there's not just one way to be a person or to be a good person. And that's one of the things I think I kind of gently learned through the journey, is that like thinking of all this in one way doesn't get you very far.
So we've never met in person. We spent an hour or so about your last documentary on Econ Talk. We happened to talk about this phenomenon of your kidney donation in an off-camera conversation a few years ago when I was doing some research on altruism. And I don't know if this will communicate, but if I were to see you on an occasional basis, say we were in the same social circle, and we would have friends in common, or we'd be friends and have coffee together, and I would see you in those settings, I would look at you very differently than I would have if I'd not seen this documentary. And what I'm trying to say is the following. We spent an hour together talking about Kenny G, and I saw you make that, I saw your questioning him on the film. I learned something about you. But what's beautiful about this film is it forces the viewer to remember how complex human beings are, and all your roller coaster of ups and downs in this experience that's so open. It reminded me of a recent episode we did with Susan Cain, where we talked about this empathy ad that Cleveland Clinic did, where all they show you are people walking around and they put up a little description of what's going through their mind. And you, of course, have a lot on your mind. One does. And we don't remember how complicated people are. We might say, oh, Penny, she's friendly, or Penny, she's smart, or Penny, she's talented. But your film and what you just said forces the viewer to remember something profound about the human experience, which is so much going on in there. I know that about myself, and yet I have trouble remembering that about the other people I see. And my interactions with you, were we to interact face-to-face now and then, would be totally changed by this film. But what's important to remember is that's true for everybody we already do interact face-to-face with. We're only getting such a small part of who they actually are and their complexity.
Yeah. And I think that, you started this interview, as many people do, with the question, why? Why did you do this? And I just want to say, I don't know. The answer is, I honestly don't know. And I don't think we know why we do what we do. And I don't think, I think it's okay to interrogate our motivations and our intentions, but you can go crazy doing that. And I almost did during this experience. And at the end of the day, it's okay. I think it's okay if we don't know why. I don't know why. I can give you a lot of reasons why. I could say, well, Russ, I'm 40. At that time, I was 40, whatever, but now I'm 46. And I didn't have children, and that's why. And maybe you nod your head and say, yes, I can see. And on another reason, on another level, it's because of my deep involvement in the effective altruism movement, which is kind of faded now, but was very salient for me at that point in my life. That's why. Maybe it's because I could, and I had good health, and I saw my health the way other people see their money. I didn't earn this good health, and perhaps I should share it. There's so many reasons. Maybe it's because I heard about someone else who did it and I wanted to be more like them in particular. There's so many reasons, Russ. We don't know why we do what we do, and we can only guess as to why and try to find answers that satisfy other people.
Well, come back to this question about whether the number is large or small, that anyone thinks it's, quote, a good idea. And when you talk about it so-called rationally, and you do this in the film, you mentioned it earlier, well, the cost to me is small relative to the gain to other people, but those are other people. They aren't gain to you directly. You don't get to wear the sandwich board all the time saying, I was a kidney donor. And
well, again, I could, but no one would like that very much. That would
No, it's a bad idea. Let me recommend against it. But similarly, people who harbored Jews from the Nazis, it's a small number. But again, it's amazing it's anyone because they put their own life at risk. And it's even maybe harder than a laparoscopic surgery. And when those people, I think, are asked, they say, well, that's just what, it just was the phrase no-brainer is a great phrase because we use it to mean it seemed like an obviously good idea. But I think if you think about it literally, it also means I didn't use my head. It wasn't a rational decision. It was something I felt compelled to do for reasons that I can tell you, but I don't know if they're the real reasons. And that's, of course, just a fascinating thing. But let's go to the neuroscience. You interview a neuroscientist and talk about MRIs, and you yourself go through an MRI, which is amazing. The amygdala, which is a primitive part of the brain, her claim, I don't know what the magnitudes are, but her claim is that altruistic kidney donors tend to have larger amygdalas than none, and that pathologically psychopathic people have very small amygdalas, suggesting both the amygdalas are related to fear and flight, a few other things, I'm sure everything in some way, that psychopaths are not afraid of other people, and they're not very good at recognizing fear, whereas empathetic, altruistic people are really good at it, and their brain is just wired that way. And we won't spoil how in the film what we learn about your amygdalas, but this idea that somehow generous people are just, quote, hardwired to be generous is both is a little bit disturbing to me, right? And I think to most of us. Talk about that.
Well, it gets back to what I was saying earlier, like my own ambivalence or, kind of, I don't know, tension around the idea of like, are the altruists different in some way or are they just normal people? And I think the answer has to be both. I mean, I guess the way I think about the brain science part of it is there are many paths to the same outcome, many paths to the same altruistic act in this case, let's say. So I wouldn't put too much stock on like the amygdala per se. I think it's an interesting data point. I think it's worth studying more and people will study it more. And it's fascinating. What's going on in there? It's like, our attempt to understand psychological mysteries when you start trying to pin it to like the brain and brain regions. I mean, to the extent that we can do that, we're pretty early in the process and, we don't really know. We don't know much. But, and my neuroscientist, were she here, would say the same thing. But at the same time, like it does gesture at something, doesn't it? Like why why is my amygdala the size it is? Did that happen over time? Was I born that way? Were the experiences in my life, did they shape me to have an amygdala of the size that it is? Things like that I think are worth remembering. It's a snapshot. It's not a predictive test. And also, you have to always remind everybody all the time with this stuff, we're talking about averages. So it's not so there are altruistic kidney donors with small amygdalas, and there are psychopaths with large amygdalas. They're not statistically the norm. So it's not a brain test where you can find out if you're, where do you fit on the altruism scale. And it's just super important to remind people of that. It's statistically, it's on average.
In your list of stories one might tell oneself about why you do something like this, there's one thing you didn't mention. You did not mention the way you were raised, which I think people would maybe just was an oversight. But I'm curious, do you think your upbringing positioned you to do this? And my other question would be, are you a large amygdala person in other aspects? I mean, you did something extraordinary, again, a one-time thing, and I give you great honor for it. Is that elsewhere? A psychopath's usually a psychopath pretty much all day long.
I actually wonder about that. I wonder if that's true. It's probably true.
Maybe not true. I don't know.
I'll answer the second question first.
Go ahead.
Because I have thought a lot about this. I've thought a lot about the nature of creativity and the nature, in particular, of storytelling, which is my career and my vocation. Probably would have been my avocation, even if I hadn't done this for a living. But, I've wondered a lot about whether my ability to make good documentary films has something to do with my ability to be empathetic. I now see that might be a superpower I have that maybe some other people lack. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if that were true in some way. I mean, I think not everyone could have sat down with Kenny G and had such a critical but empathetic exchange with him for that amount of time. So I do think that might be related. Your first question about how I was raised is very interesting. I only gesture a little bit in the film to my family background because it's sort of it's kind of private. I kind of just put in as much as I thought was required. But
this is just you and me, by the way. So
just
you don't
me
have
and
to. You can, now that not for the film, but you can say whatever.
Off.
Yeah.
Now that the camera's off. Yeah, but I do think I have thought about this more recently, and I do think there might be something to it because I'll say in brief, most people think of, family as the source of safety, as the source of love, as the source of caring, compassion, support. I'll just say briefly that was not my experience. My family was not the source of any of those things in a quite sad way. But when I look back over my life, I do think, maybe there's something here because the care of near strangers, let's say, guidance counselors, teachers, random adults in the world who cared about me enough to do things like take me to get a library card, encourage me to go to college, help me with my applications, guide me and mentor me and show care. That really didn't come from my family. That came from people who had no familial obligation to me. So I kind of wonder if there isn't part of me that actually thinks that's normal and more normal. And because when people say, oh, of course, when you think about your mother, you think about this like boundless, kind of source of love and care. I'm like, what? That sounds good. I don't know what you're talking about. Like I've never. So I think that there might be something there, but I've only just started to think about it now, whether my care for strangers was almost more learned than I think it was in a way.
But you talk about it as mainly a modeling role for a parent. A lot of parents demand of their children empathy, demand compassion, demand good deeds in hopes that their children will not just be happy, but good. And they may even think that being good helps you be happy, but I don't think so. I think most parents who encourage their kids to do good deeds think it's just an obligation of being a human being. And that's not, it sounds like, part of your
No.
upbringing until the effective altruism movement
Influence, yeah.
influenced you and gave you a different way of thinking about a justification for selflessness.
Correct. And I think that's so beautiful and so well put. And it is part of my attraction to the idea of organized religion, which I also was not raised with, right? My film is called Confessions of a Good Samaritan, but I have no grounding in Christianity other than the kind of ambient cultural Christianity we were all raised with in America. As I get older, I yearn more for that kind of structure, that kind of like rule-based structure. And I do think wherever it comes from, I mean, Confucianism has an element of this, like, Buddhism does, like wherever, there's an element of these organized religions that is essentially at the core about how to be and like how to consider others in relation to yourself and to do the very hard work of decentering yourself from every single thing in the world. We're psychologically hardwired to think we are the center of the universe. And it seems to me that many of those rule-based systems, and learning how to be polite and just say thank you for a gift, like that's something you have to learn. Yeah. And be taught. And so there's something very deep about that I found very moving and like mystical in this experience. And that's why the film is the film it is. If I could express to you in words what this experience meant to me, I just would, and I'd move on. But, film is a visual medium. It has other ways of expressing truth. And some of the things in the film are images. They're not words. I couldn't say it with just words. There's a lot more to the experience. And this religious iconography was part of that, part of me hearkening back to like, these are ancient questions. I did not come up with them. I certainly didn't solve them. But I felt that ultimately what was beautiful about the experience was that I was participating in this centuries-old human dilemma and kind of touching like this kind of mysterious core of what it means to be a person, not just a good person, just a person in the world. And I just, it makes me want to cry. Like it's so deep and it's so meaningful to me ultimately, so much more meaningful than the way I was thinking about it initially, which was like a math problem. Yeah. I have this much kidney function and this person has this much and therefore,
Yeah. I should just mention that in Judaism, according to Maimonides, one of the great Jewish thinkers, the highest level of charity is when it's anonymous, that when neither person knows the other, neither the recipient or the donor. And I think part of that is to strip away the selfish component, even as mild a selfish component as getting thanked by the person you've helped. And I think that your point about, I've said it different ways on the program over the years. We are very self-centered, human beings are, and growing up is realizing you're not the center of the universe, and whether a religion helps you get there, or literature, or meditation, or psychotherapy, these are all ways of learning to be self-aware about your relative unimportance. Having said that, you have a scene, and don't worry, no one's going to watch this film and think, well, she is kind of a Christian. You're not particularly into Christianity, it appears, but you have a clip from a Billy Graham speech, a live clip from his speech. And at some point he asked people to come down and either, I forget more what they're asked to do, but it's a common thing in these kind of evangelical moments. And people stream down, and some of it's surely social pressure and a need to join the group. But when you think about religion, one of the strangest things about it, and it's similar to being a kidney donor, is that as much as we have this impulse to take care of ourselves and to put ourselves first, we have this other impulse, which is to not do that, to rise above it. I'm not sure it's all cultural. There's a huge cultural component, of course, but there's something glorious about diminishing oneself, of recognizing one's own finitude, one's own smallness. And it's interesting that is rewarding rather than degrading for some people. Not everybody, of course. But I think you could say, I'm not going to say it, it's your call, that your desire to give a kidney is fundamentally a religious impulse, not in the organized sense, but in the sense of recognizing your relative unimportance.
Well, I agree. And that 100% I agree. And that's why the film has the title it has, despite my lack of knowledge about Christianity. I mean, luckily everyone knows the parable of the Good Samaritan, and you don't have to really even be a Christian to be inspired by it. There's something amazing about the parable format. And I think that that's part of what I was trying to mimic with my own film in a weird way, because, Jesus brings these people together and he tells them a story. And at the end of the story, he says, and who is your neighbor? Who was the neighbor to the man who, and everyone says, well, the Samaritan. Most people don't know that the Samaritan was a distant stranger to the people that Jesus was talking to. He's a man from another religion, from another race. I think even a despised, disliked other religion and other race. And that's why he chose that example. And so anyway, at the end of the story, he's like, so who is your neighbor? And what are you supposed to say? Everybody? I mean, if everybody's your neighbor, how many billions of people on the planet are there? How are you supposed to deal with that? What do you do with that? And I love that because it's a question. It's not an answer. And I think the parable format is kind of a challenge. It's a provocation. And I really relate to that artistically. The last thing I would ever do is just be anyway, so go give your kidney. Here's a phone number to call. I would never do that in a million years, even though it would probably help me explain my film better. I'd have a much easier answer to why I did this film if I was just to tell other people to do it. I mean, it really wasn't my goal. I hope other people will do it, and they have, and they will, and that's great. But I wanted to do a parable. I wanted to do a challenge. Here's a provocation to you. Do with it what you will. And that was kind of my goal artistically. But yes, I do agree. I think it's a religious impulse. I think ultimately that's why I did it.
To the extent there is a why.
Yeah.
I will let you know, I'm a Jew. I really didn't know what the Good Samaritan parable was until I saw your film. Don't tell anybody. And we'll get some people to criticize me and or to correct me, but I think they're all Jews. Jesus and his buddies and the Samaritan. But there may be
let's
some...
look into it. Someone will have to tell us. Someone who knows better than me.
There's some judgment definitely there. And I think but the deeper point for me is somebody has to step up. And this is true of many moments in our lives. We don't all step up to give a kidney, but there are many times in our life when we're asked to do something that's not just for us. And will you answer that call? I just heard a remarkable set of remarks from Rabbi Benjamin Levy, who was talking here in Jerusalem about upcoming Yom Kippur, which is a day of self-reflection. And he quoted a bit of a parable from Alan Paton. And I forgot the novel. It's not Cry the Beloved Country. It's a different one. And I've forgotten all the details. But the gist of it, and I was reminded of this when I saw your film, the gist of it is a person dies and goes to the afterlife and is asked about what they've done. And at one point, the angel or God says, "Where are your wounds? Where are your wounds?" And the person says, "What do you mean, my wounds?" And the response is, "Wasn't there anything down there worth fighting for?" And I find that profound. It's a different version of what we're talking about. And Penny, you have a wound. Yours happens to be physical. Some of us have physical wounds, but many of us have psychological wounds for the things we fight for and the things we endure and our challenges as human beings. And you flash your scar very briefly. It's not a very bloody film, but you have a wound now that you will carry the rest of your life that says something that you thought was worth fighting for.
Oh, I think that's so beautiful. Again, I'm trying not to cry. I think, where are your wounds? I also find it symbolically moving that the scar, it looks like a C-section scar. It's just a little smaller. It's in the same place. And I do think there's a fundamental aspect to this. There's a reason that, my 10% tithing to charity doesn't give me the same feeling that scar does. We're talking about our bodies. We're talking about our visceral, frail, needy, dying bodies, that we're spending most of our time trying to protect and keep alive, in the face of death. And giving of your body, which mothers do for their children, is really, I think it's really profound. And I do think there's an element of this that was that for me. Again, as a childless person, I don't want to say that was the case for any other donor. Many donors are parents, And let me say too, because in my fundamental interest of reminding people that not all families are loving and kind or a source of goodness in the world. In fact, many families are terrible. And if you speak to if you speak to transplant surgeons, kind of off the record, they'll tell you that, while everyone walks around saying, well, of course, if it were my child, I would give a kidney, that is not true. In fact, many, 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 many supposedly, close family members do not step up to help their family member in need, even if they can. So it's worth saying that, because it's sort of taken as almost for granted that, of course, people step up. But I know a transplant surgeon who works in pediatric transplant. And so he does kidney transplants for babies. And he said to me off camera, you'd be shocked at how many parents will not step up for their infant child. So I just want to disrupt the kind of automatic assumption that we all have that, of course, we do it for our loved one. No, actually, most people won't do it for their loved one. Maybe not most. I don't want to make a number, but a good number of people won't even do it for someone that they feel bound to in some way. So there's something deep there that it is a difficult thing to do. It is a sacrifice. I think even people who don't know all the details instinctively understand that this is a sacrifice, a real sacrifice that is very different from sending 10% of your paycheck to someone else. Really different.
Yeah. You talk about the reaction some people have to this, that the human body, I'll phrase it a little differently. It's a cathedral. Your body is a cathedral. It's given from God. You shouldn't despoil it by, certainly not to sell a kidney, or to get a tax benefit for getting a kidney, which just comes up with in the program, in the film. But it's fascinating to me how it's a visceral sacrifice, literally, by turning your body into a stock house of spare parts. Mm-hmm. That's the ugly way to say it. Mm-hmm. The attractive way to say it is by allowing your most precious vehicle that carries you through life, your body, to risk it to save another human being seems not like a kind of commercial, crude thing to do, but a rather holy thing to do. And it's fascinating to me that some people find it repellent.
Think about the immune system. The immune system is a major part of this surgery, right? Because in general, your body will reject tissue from another being. There is an attempt on the part of your body to prevent this kidney from coming in, and it will kill it immediately if you don't suppress your immune system for the rest of your life. And actually, eventually, it'll be rejected. My kidney, if, God willing, if it were successful, which I assume it was, and this stranger out there is doing good with my kidney 5 years later, on average, it should last about 15 to 20 years if all goes well, but it will eventually reject my kidney. So there's this kind of naturalistic argument you could make that, your immune system is trying to tell you something, Russ. Strangers are dangerous. Keep them away. And so it's not that that's really an answer, but I do think we have a lot of reasons to fear the stranger and to keep them away. There's something to it. So it's not all we should all just, rip open our bodies, we'll die. So there's something there that I think there's a question mark there, I think, for a lot of us.
It's really weird, but my dad passed away a few years ago. I'm 70. And I think it's been at least 50 years since I felt the following, that my grandfather didn't have, I think he lost a kidney, had to lose the functioning of a kidney. And in the back of my mind when I was a little boy, I always had this fear that my dad would have to give up a kidney for his father, and then I'd have to give up one for my dad if his kidney ever went awry.
Wow.
And I wonder, and I remember that anxiety as a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old.
Wow.
And yet decades passed, I've totally forgotten about it, even though I've done kidney donation episodes. It wasn't until the emotional power of your film that made me remember that anxiety. And it's, I don't know if this is answerable, and of course part of your movie is an illustration of this, but why are we so afraid? It's interesting. Surgery, like the surgery went through, it's pretty safe. It may be very safe, and yet it's fearful. And most people give blood. Not most people, but many people give blood. It's such a level higher. It is so much scarier, right? I mean, people give blood, do it with some unease sometimes, but this, the I don't know why it's so hard. And you talked earlier about derogation. What kind of do-gooder derogation? And I confess, I'm talking about how great you are, and I aspire to be a good person, and yet I can't imagine it. I can't.
Wait, why for you? You have to tell me why. Why can't you imagine it?
I think it's pure fear. I think it's pure selfishness.
Fair. I think that's fair. I think it's fair to be afraid of surgery. Most people are.
Yeah.
And one of the things I found out when I made the film that I didn't even know until after I did my own surgery, and I drop it in late in the film to reflect that, is that 90% of people who say they want to be an altruistic kidney donor drop out at some point. Some of that might be social pressure or pressure from their families. I've seen a lot of that. That's a real thing. But I bet a lot of it is fear. People are afraid of surgery. That's okay.
I'm a coward.
Me too.
I'm a coward. By the way, I think eating meat is wrong, but I love meat. And that's a purely selfish, wrong is too strong a word. I understand the moral case against meat eating. It's multifaceted. But if you said to me, well, then why don't you give up meat? It's really hard. Would be really hard for me. I could do it, but I'm not that good, quote, as that good a person. And I salve my conscience and self-image by saying, well, I do give 10%, right, of my income to charity. So, I can see myself as a good person. It's a fascinating, your film obviously is deep into these issues, and viewers will enjoy seeing that. But it's a fascinating thing. We're afraid of a lot of stuff, and we're still pretty selfish.
Here's something else we're afraid of. There's this idea in bioethics that comes from the study of organ transplantation. And the idea is the tyranny of the gift. And the idea of this concept is that some gifts are so big and so incommensurable and so generous that when you give them, the recipient has been tyrannically, tyrannized by it. The joke is oh, someone gave you a kidney. What'd you get them for Christmas? And it's ha, ha, ha. But oh man, really though? What did you get them for Christmas? And it's challenging because sometimes we're afraid of burdening somebody. And I've felt this in my own life. There have been times where I've helped somebody in a way that was maybe over the top. Mm-hmm. And I've seen the discomfort it causes. There are people who give a kidney to their brother and their relationship's never the same and not necessarily in a good way. So there's this other side of it where you don't want to, in order to feel like a good person, do something that's so big and so generous and so insane that you've now made it harder for the recipient to live with themselves. Obviously, that's part of the desire of doing it anonymously, is to spare someone of that potential burden. But I do think there's a lot of different fears that go into this. We started this conversation by talking about how I was afraid people would think that I was actually just a narcissist looking for attention. There's a lot of things there are a lot of things to be afraid of in the idea of giving a kidney to a stranger. Many, many, many things. Not all of them are just about you dying on the surgical table, which is very rare.
This idea of the tyranny of the gift, it makes me think as a parent, when you're a kid, you don't really appreciate your parents. You don't know how much work it is. And then you have a kid and you realize how hard it is and how much your parents gave you. And yet, you really don't feel that indebtedness the way in a normal human relationship would be. You kind of say to yourself, well, they're my parents. Of course they took care of me. And it's kind of it's a one-way street. Parents feel very differently about their children than children feel about their parents. Obviously, there's degrees on both directions, as we've alluded to. Mm-hmm. But it would be, I guess, unbearable to grow up if you fully internalized what your parents have done for you. And it's kind of a protective mechanism that, and because the parents don't want it, by the way. The parents don't want the kids to feel so indebted that they can't function. And it shouldn't be that every Christmas or birthday, the kid gets the parents an even nicer gift because that time, all those years. And it doesn't work that way. Yeah.
Well, to be fair, I mean, gift giving isn't supposed to work that way. It is supposed to be a free, we just know that there's also networks of obligation that we're all in. So we can say like, well, of course you don't have to repay someone for a gift, but on some level, you kind of do or you don't. It's a complicated thing, the gift economy, isn't it? Yeah,
for sure. And having said that, my kids gave me a wonderful 70th birthday present. Will not reveal on this program, but I'm deeply grateful.
Oh, good job, kids.
It wasn't just how much it cost. It was the thought.
Oh, sweet.
We'll move along here. Okay, listeners may hear some playground noise. That is unavoidable. Don't worry about it.
Penny would never. It's recess across the street.
And it'll keep you from having. It's not keep you from having children. Hearing these screams. There's an aspect of this that you capture in the film that a non-participant can't appreciate, and that's how complicated it is. If you had said to me, what's hard about giving a kidney? I would have said, well, you have to have surgery. But the challenge of getting approved took a toll on you. And one example was the healthcare proxy and the psychosocial or whatever it's called exam, because they want to make sure that, quote, you're not doing it for the wrong reason. You may not be able to tell them what the right reason is, but they certainly don't want you to do it for the wrong reason that we talked about earlier. Talk about that whole roller coaster. Very hard.
Yeah, it is kind of hard. So obviously first there's like a very serious battery of physical tests. Like you are not giving a kidney if there's any chance that the kidney transplant centers can see that this is going to be bad for you. That's why it's so safe. It's safer than other surgeries because of the intensive screening process, not because the surgery itself is safer than other laparoscopic surgeries. So that was kind of a pain and like unpleasant, and just spending a lot of time in the hospital, shockingly, is kind of alienating and sad and not fun. But the part that really got me, as you alluded to, was the psychosocial evaluation. I mean, gosh, I had already spent 3 years failing to satisfy anyone with my answer to the question why. And I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to say to this social worker who's going to ask me why? Like everyone else has seemed like my answers were very strange. And I have a history of mental illness in my family. And in the past, I had tried to sign up for certain psychological tests to like earn money in college, and I was rejected because of that past. And so I think I had this like vestigial kind of like, they're going to reject me because of this. They're going to reject me because my grandmother was schizophrenic, like that, So I think even the first time I called them, I was like, my grandmother's schizophrenic, just so you know. And they were like, okay. Like,
bye.
Okay, whatever. They didn't care.
Okay.
But, but I think I was just so afraid that I'd be rejected, and that, being a person who has a complicated interior life, who's struggled with depression at times, who can have pretty high anxiety, who has this family history of trauma and mental illness, I thought, gosh, what will I feel about myself if they reject me? I feel like that'll have a really negative impact on my self-image. I want to believe I'm strong enough at this point in my life to like withstand, the rigors of major surgery, the economic cost, the social cost, the psychological cost, all of it, the physical cost. And I thought, gosh, if they tell me I'm too weak, it's gonna be bad for my self-image. So I passed the test. I'm not sure why, or if I was close to not passing the test, it like still haunts me. Like, was I very close to the line? I think that if I'd gone to a different transplant, also people think that there must be some like really standardized rule book on this, and there isn't. I know donors who went to one transplant center and they were turned down, and they just went to another one and they were accepted. So, maybe they learned how to answer those questions better, or maybe that transplant center just had a different standard. So it's not like a super clear-cut guidebook about who they're going to accept as a donor. I know people who are a part of a very small religious sect, which some people might think is a cult, and they were turned down because they were perceived to be in a cult. And which is very insulting to the people I'm thinking of, because they were like, what? Like, you don't like my religion? Really? That's the reason? So there's a lot of weirdness in that world. And I don't blame the transplant centers for this weirdness. They're struggling to manage a quite complicated, as we've been talking about, a quite complicated thing. And they can't afford to have controversies or horrible outcomes where, honestly, one bad news story about altruistic donation could end the whole practice. Yeah. Honestly, one altruistic donor dying in surgery might end the whole practice. So they really have to be just very, very cautious with how they manage it.
Was the medical team, who do show up on camera, and of course, as you say, we see you roll down the corridor, we see you interacting with some of the medical team. Was it hard to get them to agree to be filmed? Were they uneasy? Or did you sign a non-disclosure that you wouldn't talk about it?
No, I didn't sign an NDA. It wasn't that hard, actually. I think that there was a sense that the film would be a good advertisement, in a sense, for the idea of kidney transplantation, and I think there's a great need for it. And that there are, in America, about 100,000 people on a list waiting for a kidney. Most of them will never get one, and most of them will die on that list, having suffered through many years of dialysis, which is itself a life-saving technology, but is not a great way to live. So I think that they were more excited than not. It was also a pretty new medical building, and they gave me a really nice room with a beautiful view. So I think that I might have gotten a nicer room because I had the camera crew with me.
Nice. Of course, I'm only doing this interview, Penny, because I'm hoping people will make a donation of a kidney, and that'll make assuage my conscience that that I don't give mine, but at least I can say Econ Talk helped. But
yes, I'm telling you, Econ Talk did help.
Yeah, well,
I think Sally Satel is in my film. I know who Sally Satel is because of Econ Talk. Okay.
Okay. And Virginia Postrel donated her kidney to
also in my
Econ
film.
Talk. So we have a lot of Econ Talk guests in this film. Technical question: as a filmmaker, a lot of people put themselves in their own documentaries. Alfred Hitchcock has cameos. This was not a cameo. You were the star of the film, or your kidney was, which we see very briefly in plastic, just again to make people feel somewhat okay with the potential queasiness.
Yeah, it's really not a gross film, I promise. There's not a lot of like blood, guts, and gore, I promise, I promise.
It's not. But what was it like to be... to have your crew do some of the heavy lifting for a change, and you be giving up some control? You certainly allowed yourself to be filmed. You could have not used that footage when you were coming out of surgery. You decided to because it was so powerful. As a filmmaker, you were stuck with it. You couldn't cut it out. What was that like as a filmmaker?
I would say it was very creatively challenging. a lot of people don't think a lot about the craft of documentary filmmaking. There's a sense that you just like turn the camera on and capture reality and show it to people. But of course, it is a very intensive craft, and you make many thousands of decisions along the way. And one of those sets of decisions have to do with your main character. So you're thinking about, you're taking a real person, and this real person has a lifetime of experiences. They have opinions, they have contradictions, they have relationships. There's a million things about a person that makes them who they are. And as a filmmaker, and you're making a feature, you have to make a set of decisions about which parts of that person are you going to represent, and what are you going to leave out? Because you're going to leave out almost everything. It's always a strange process, but I've never seen how strange it is really until now, because I had to do it to myself. And I found that very painful and very confusing. What do people need to know about this character to understand her on this journey? How do I represent the complexity of my interior world, but also give you a satisfying character arc? This was very hard to do for myself. And I really had to rely, as you already said, on my creative collaborators, many of whom are longtime creative collaborators, thank goodness, because I trusted them completely. And I was like, you need to shape this person, this Penny person, because I can't see her. I don't know what she is. I don't understand how other people will experience this moment or this joke. Is this joke too tacky, or is it funny? I couldn't tell at all. Whereas, and it was actually interesting because it made me realize that I'm really good at that in general. But now I know that because I look back at how I shaped other characters, and I'm like, oh yeah, that was a really pretty easy process to understand which aspects of Kenny G were relevant to my story, or which aspects of the Satanic Temple were relevant to my story. And now I'm clueless. I mean, I look back at the film now and I can see, okay, I see the choices we made. I get it. But in the process, it was just incredibly frustrating and hard.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you thought about Kenny G while you were editing this and thinking about the things you left out about him. I mean, the Kenny G documentary is effective because it's a mix of adulation and from his fans, criticism from his critics, from music critics, but that's only half the story. The other half that makes that documentary so extraordinary is we get to know him. Mm-hmm. And he's complicated, and he's damaged, and so on. But I'm sure when you were making this film, which you're the center of, you thought, I wonder if I should have, was I fair to, did you think about Kenny G at all?
I thought about everyone I've ever made a film about, because what a weird experience it is for them to watch someone else explain who they are. I mean, how strange is that? Again, I believe my ability to be empathetic has something to do with how good I am at that process, because I know that I've never misrepresented somebody. I've never tried to twist them into something they're not. The greatest compliment I can get as a documentary director is that if somebody meets the subject of my film and they say, oh yeah, they were just like they were in your film, I feel really satisfied and happy, because I am trying to be accurate and fair and empathetic to people. And I think people are really complicated, and I want to honor that. But I'm also working within a framework that has certain conventions, a sort of 3-act structure, the idea that there should be change over time in the character, which is kind of sometimes we have to kind of fictionalize that a little bit, just to create the feeling of a journey. But you still, you want to be fair and you want to be accurate. And I feel like those are pretty good rules, and empathetic. And I think those are pretty good rules. So I think looking back, I felt satisfied with how I'd done that with other people, but I definitely think there's an element of just how weird that feels that I think I understand better.
Yeah, the crazy thing about a documentary is it's supposed to be reality, but in some fundamental sense, as you point out very profoundly, I think, you have to leave out so much.
Everything.
You're essentially giving, everything. You're giving the viewer a fictionalized version, a stylized version at best of what another human being is like. And that's, in some sense, the craft of the documentary filmmaker, is that character arc or the narrative arc. And it, in some sense, dehumanizes the main character. And I don't know if you feel that way as the subject of this one. Do you?
A little bit, yeah, because I think that you create a persona out of a person, and that is necessary and part of your job. You have to think which aspects of this person are relevant to the story I'm telling, and you have to be brutal about leaving out the stuff that isn't. That said, then you've created a partial impression of a real person, which you don't have this problem in fiction. This is a real person who will now live in the world with this partial representation of them out there. And, you hope you did no harm at minimum, right? I mean, geez. So yeah, I do feel it more now because I feel like the whole world will watch this film and will have a very particular impression of who I am as a person. And it isn't the whole story. For example, I realized in the edit that there was a real vein of loneliness and a search for connection or a need for connection that was running through the film. And once I realized that, I leaned into it and I began editing in a way that would emphasize that so that you would feel the vein of loneliness and search for connection. Therefore, I cut out all of my friends. You would watch this film and believe that Penny Lane has no friends. And I do have friends, and I actually filmed a lot with my friends. I filmed a lot with my friends in the course of making the film, and I cut them all out because I was trying to create an impression, and I really made it very stark so that you'd feel it. You wouldn't have noticed that Penny felt lonely and needed connection if you'd seen all her friends around her all the time. So now I've created the impression of myself as a friendless soul alone in the big city, which isn't true, obviously, but it's true enough. It's true that I feel lonely. It's true that I feel isolated. It's true that I think living in modernity is isolating and lonely. And I think that living in a studio apartment in New York is isolating and lonely. So I do think there's truth to it, but factually, I left out the friends, right?
Fascinating. It makes me think that every documentary and not just every movie should say based on a true story. Right?
I think that's true.
It's definitely the person who's captured in Confessions of a Good Samaritan reminds me a lot of the person it's based on, Penny Lane, even though I don't know you, Penny, very well. And I would just want to mention for listeners that the reference you made to a satanic temple is you have an earlier documentary called Hail Satan. But for the listeners who don't know that might have been a jarring moment when it was juxtaposed with Kenny G. Let me close with a easy and impossible question. You've had time to reflect on the experience because of the time that's passed. And I'm curious how it's changed you. Obviously, you have one fewer kidney than you had in 2019. And you may, but I'm curious, how often do you think about it? Which is unfair because you're promoting a movie right now. So put that to the side. In the last 5 years, how often do you think about it every day?
No.
Did it change? Did it change the way you interacted with your friends or the way they interacted with you?
I will say a couple things. One thing I kind of alluded to earlier, which is I feel that I've gained a new fact about myself, about an action that I took that is without a doubt altruistic. Whatever you think about my intentions, I'm willing to put all that aside and say it's an altruistic act regardless of whatever the intention really was. It was altruistic. That's beautiful and gives me a sense of self-respect or dignity or pleasure. I'm not sure what the right word is. You'd probably have a better word for it than me. The other thing I would say is, I didn't think very much about how my decision to do this surgery would impact the people who love me. I think I didn't think enough about it. And it was really only after the fact that I looked back and thought, gosh, my camera crew, like my friends, all these people rallied around me, and they must have all been at least slightly afraid of what could happen and whether there'd be a bad outcome. And every one of them held their tongue, and nobody that I care about tried to talk me out of it which I'm very appreciative of, but I also, in retrospect, realized that my choice did put a burden on the people who love me. And I just think that is something that now I think about more. The web of connectivity that I'm in. And, I think of myself, as I said, as this kind of independent spirit bouncing around in the world all alone in her studio apartment. But I do think more about the way that I'm connected to others and how my choices affect them. I did ask something of my community. I asked them to support me through this process. And they did, mostly. And that changed me, I think, a little bit. In a way, I became the sick person, didn't I? I made myself into the sick person. I was now the person who had to spend time in the hospital and deal with the fear of surgery and have recovery and need people to come and help me after surgery, prepare a meal and clean my cat litter box. I became the needy sick person in the process and had to throw myself on the mercy of my loved ones. And they came to my aid. And I think that we all have to experience that in our lives. I didn't realize that I was doing that, but I did. And I think that changed me to some extent.
My guest today has been Penny Lane. Her film is Confessions of a Good Samaritan. Penny, thanks for being part of Econ Talk.
Anytime, Russ.
This is Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more Econ Talk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for Econ Talk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.